The people do nothing but confer honours upon him. They will have him Master of the Horse in the Duke of Buckingham's place. He will be the Commander of Scotland instead of my Lord Lauderdale, and General of the land forces." These were the words and possible promotions that awaited Monmouth and his glorious return to England after his heroics at Maastricht. One Henry Ball wrote that Monmouth himself wanted no caresses to bid his welcome, but others would make him Viceroy of Scotland, Lieutenant General, or whatever can be imagined. This was a perfect time for Monmouth, because England was in need of a hero, and by George, she had one. A gleaming prince, brave, conscientious, a hero of royal blood, with a genuine connection to the common man. A contemporary writer put it, he was easy with all men. On top of this, men were honouring him by tipping their hats in the now fashionable Monmouth cock, whilst others exclaimed, "God bless the Protestant Duke," every time he stepped out of a carriage. Events would conspire to hoist Monmouth further up the ladder. The capture of Maastricht was still to be coupled with the landings on the Zeeland coast. The expeditionary force was still encamped at Blackheath. Christopher Hatton, who himself was based at the camp, wrote that the Duke is coming to command us. Henry Ball again reported, "The Duke of Buckingham is resolved not to go under the Comte de Schomberg, nor he be under him. The Duke of Monmouth coming home, who will be here on Saturday next, will end all." And yet, this was not to be. For although the Zeeland expedition would have been ecstatic to have Monmouth command them, it was destined to be shelved. Schomberg, who had the command, had quarrelled with Prince Rupert, who was commanding the fleet. By the time Schomberg's force had reached Yarmouth, it was almost in a state of mutiny. To make matters worse for the English cause, Rupert had run into the Dutch off the Texel and received a battering at the hands of De Ruyter and Tromp. Being badly let down by the French squadrons, the battle ended in a bloody stalemate, and therefore the invasion of Zeeland had to be postponed. After this indecisive clash, it was suggested that Monmouth replace Rupert as head of the fleet, but the fleet was to remain in port, the Zeeland operation completely cancelled, and Monmouth, on his uncle's recommendation, was put at the head of all military affairs. King Charles as ever was immensely proud of his eldest son, and the influence and love that the army and officer corps had for him. To celebrate his son's heroics at Maastricht, the siege was reenacted at Windsor. John Evelyn was there and seems to have been in wonder at the spectacle. He writes, "In one of the meadows at the foot of the long terrace below the castle, bastions, bulwarks, ramparts, palisades, hornworks, counterscarps, they were all constructed. It was attacked by the Duke of Monmouth, newly come from the real siege, and the Duke of York with a little army, to show their skill in tactics. On Saturday night they made their approaches, opened trenches, raised batteries, took the counterscarp and ravelin after a stout defence. Great guns fired on both sides, grenadoes hot, mines sprung, parties sent out, attempts of raising the siege, prisoners taken, parleys, and in short, all the circumstances of a formal siege. And what is most strange, all without disorder or ill incident, to the great satisfaction of 1,000 spectators. Being night, it made a formidable show. The siege then being over, I went with Mr. Pepys back to London, where we arrived at 3 in the morning." It might seem strange with Monmouth being so celebrated, that his uncle, the Duke of York, the Catholic Duke, was still affectionate to his nephew. One Robert Yard wrote a note soon after the reenactment. His Royal Highness dined at the Duke of Monmouth's, who were together most of the afternoon. It being observed by those that are near his Royal Highness that he has a particular kindness and affection for his Grace, upon whom all the world looks as a rising sun. Many will have him as Master of the Horse in the room of the Duke of Buckingham, who, in the general opinion, is now declining in his interest at court. It was not long before Monmouth did indeed receive the coveted post of Master of the Horse at the expense of the Duke of Buckingham. But this was not all. The same year he was appointed as Privy Councillor for Scotland, Chancellor of Cambridge, and in August High Steward of Kingston upon Hull, and in October Commissioner of the Admiralty. Yet he didn't accept every appointment dangled before him. As the Duke of Buccleuch, he was already Scotland's Lord High Chamberlain for life, and he was seen as the only man in high enough stature to become Scotland's Viceroy, and yet he refused the post. His father the King appeared happy with his refusal, knowing Monmouth wanted to be near any action which might still be happening in the Netherlands. But despite his meteoric rise, family cracks were beginning to appear, particularly those between nephew and uncle, between Protestant and Catholic Duke. By the end of 1674, the year after Maastricht, York was becoming jealous of his nephew's appointments, and in the late summer it was reported that there was a great feud between York and Monmouth. The whole court backs Monmouth. Their growing antagonism started to spread. The Duchess of Monmouth, who had a close relationship with the Duchess of York, had used her friendship to make her husband considerable. But now Monmouth was seeing his uncle as a rival. He forbade her to receive any more visits from him. Extramarital relationships were being strained as well. The King, Charles II, is renowned for his womanising, but his brother York was even more infamous. In the early 1670s, Monmouth, York and Lord Mulgrave were all courting the same mistress, one Moll Kirke, sister to a certain Percy Kirke, who would play an infamous and villainous role in the Monmouth Rebellion. The Duke of Monmouth became exceedingly jealous of Mulgrave and his amorous relationship with Moll Kirke, who was a maid of honour to the Duchess of York. To keep him out of the way, he would order the lifeguards to detain Mulgrave on some official yet unnecessary pretext. Like most relationships at court, it became public knowledge fairly quickly. York, believing it was only Mulgrave who he had to compete with, used his waning influence with the army. He postponed Mulgrave's appointment to command of the 1st Foot Guards, but Mulgrave had the ultimate revenge by telling York he had a more successful rival in his own nephew. York would never forgive Monmouth. Moll Kirke would not be his only mistress. Monmouth took Eleanor Needham as a mistress, the most beautiful of all the court beauties, and had 4 children with her, in less than 4 years. They all assumed the name of Croft. But the army was what held Monmouth's heart. By the end of 1673, the king ordered that all military documents should be brought to the Duke for approval. Crossing back over to France to consult with the French command and reorganise the British in the Sun King's service, he was once again content. In January 1674, the king, his father, ordered him to have an inspection into all things relating to the forces now on foot, so that all orders are brought to him, and he examines them and then presents them to the king to be signed. It is initiating him into the business, and he is not like to be denied anything he should be found capable to manage. The commander of the Coldstream Guards, the Earl of Craven, was to command in chief during the king's absence at or near Windsor. All troops left behind for the security of London and Westminster, wherein he is to observe such orders as our dearest and most beloved son, James, Duke of Monmouth, shall give him from time to time. It is perhaps necessary to pause and just focus on what Monmouth was responsible for, never mind all his civilian duties. To begin with, he had control over the regular forces based in Britain, 2 regiments of cavalry and 4 of foot, as well as 30 non-regimented garrison companies. Abroad, he held a watching brief over the Tangier garrison, as well as all the forces in Scotland, Ireland, and the thousands of men who served in the militia. But his largest responsibility was the forces at this time occupied in the Netherlands. Now this is where the politics of the period gets a little bit confusing. The Anglo-Dutch Treaty was signed in 1674, yet none of the British units were withdrawn from the French service. Over the winter of 1674-5, another 5,000 reinforcements were sent to bolster our forces. Monmouth conducted his affairs with aplomb, whether he was on the continent or in London. It was not only military affairs that consumed his time and energy. In May 1675, a near repeat of the Great Fire of London occurred in Southwark. A pamphlet ran, "A sad and dreadful fire broke out in Southwark, which burned with much violence all that day and part of the next, in which extremity his Grace, the Duke of Monmouth, was pleased to take abundance of care and pains, in ordering and directing and exposed his person to very great hazards in assisting those who laboured to extinguish the fire by blowing up of houses, and like discovering a great sense he had of the common calamity, very much sympathising with them in their suffering. No matter what direction the Duke's life took from here, we cannot fault his personal bravery. It would seem that the Duke had more hours in the day than anyone else. Everyone relied on him, and the advice that poured from his lodgings at the cockpit. As Captain Commandant of the Lifeguards, Monmouth was responsible for the guards at Whitehall, which consisted of 100 private gentlemen and the very real security and safety of the King's person. As Master of the Horse, a veteran rider and cavalryman, he also supervised the breeding of horses to supply the army with quality remounts. And in this capacity, he received foreign emissaries when English horses were in demand. When not organising the defence of the crown and the realm, he was also recognised for taking his civilian responsibilities seriously as well. At this time, he was in meetings and discussions with his roles as Chancellor of Cambridge, Chief Justice in Eyre and of the Forest south of the Trent, Scottish High Lord Chamberlain and Lord Lieutenant of Staffordshire. But what of the bitterness between Monmouth and his uncle, Duke of York? The names Protestant Duke and the Catholic Duke were no mere nicknames. They had purpose and a sinister intent, an intent to divide and anger. Up until now, Monmouth had skirted around politics and had managed to keep himself fairly clean in regard to its dirty dealings. But now, it was not just soldiers, sheriffs, grooms, servants and sailors who looked to him as a figurehead. Now it was also politicians, religious leaders, dissenters, nonconformists, Whigs, Commonwealth men, and supporters of the old cause. The latter too, intent on reducing the power of the monarchy and to fight the ever-present and sinister threat that was Catholicism. And most importantly, to ensure that James, Duke of York, would not become king after Charles II's death, and that he himself would not begin a new Catholic dynasty. The leader of this opposition to crown and regal authority was the leader of the country or Whig party, the Earl of Shaftesbury, a former member of the King's cabal. Shaftesbury had not always been anti-royalist. In the English Civil Wars, he, at the tender age of 19, and at his own expense, had raised a troop of cavalry and commanded it for the king. But this was not to last, for a year later he was for Parliament and served Cromwell as President of the Council. He must have been a very able as well as flexible individual, as at the Restoration he soon found a place in Charles II's government. But his attitude towards toleration of dissenters and the exclusion of Catholics brought him into conflict with the king, many nobles, and the Duke of York. Shaftesbury would prove a constant and nagging thorn in the king's side, for he knew that the king was secretly Catholic. He was also horrified that not only had the Duke of York taken a Catholic as his second wife, but had also become a Catholic himself. Shaftesbury was adamant York must not succeed his brother. He had plans and was not afraid to follow them through. His first option was a non-starter. The Queen, Catherine of Braganza, was now unlikely to have any children. It would be near impossible to persuade Charles to divorce his wife, marry a younger bride, and then try to produce a legitimate heir. This did not work. Charles himself was heard to snap, "I will not put away the Queen." Another option was Prince Rupert. After all, he was of royal blood. But there was too much against him, despite his being Protestant and vehemently anti-French. His foreignness and his age were in the end to keep him out of contention. How about the Protestant hero across the North Sea? The prince who was defending the Netherlands against the massed armies of Louis XIV. Perhaps a royal bride could be found to marry William, Prince of Orange. Then the country would have a Protestant king who was even more anti-French than Prince Rupert. It was to eventually be Shaftesbury's triumph to marry the prince to the Duke of York's eldest daughter Mary, but would eventually become monarchs after the glorious revolution of 1688. But there was one more option, of course, the subject of this series, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth. Married to a great Scottish peeress and heiress, a man who wore his hat in the company of the king, a man in charge of the army, Rich, handsome, possessing the common touch, and treated as the Prince of Wales in all but name, and above all, Protestant. He appeared the perfect choice for a still worried nation when it came to the question of religion and the royal succession. God forbid the country had another Catholic monarch on the throne. But of course, there was a snag, and would literally prove to be fatal. The murky matter of his birth and the fact he was illegitimate. Shaftesbury banked on the fact that the king's early years in exile were shrouded in mystery, and with the right evidence and persuasive campaigning, it could be possible to make people believe that Charles and Lucy Walter were married when Monmouth was born. Shaftesbury busied himself over the coming months and years, finding evidence and witnesses to put his conspiracy into action. To this end, in 1675, a private Whig society was formed with its headquarters at the King's Head in Chancery Lane. On special days, they wore green ribbons in their hats. It was soon to be known as the Green Ribbon Club. Monmouth, of course, was not only a regular visitor, but their patron, and in his honour wore their hats with the now famous Monmouth cock and addressed him as Prince of Wales. Along with Monmouth, there were many close friends in this group, including Lord Russell, Thomas Tyne, and his constant comrade Sir Thomas Armstrong. But as well as these trusted men, there were dangerous and scheming individuals. Men who would play a dark and disastrous role in Monmouth's life in the years to come. Men such as Robert Ferguson, Shaftesbury's chaplain and pamphleteer. Ferguson was a fanatical preacher who had spent time in prison and was described as a tall, thin, wild-looking man whose spirit was naturally turned to plotting. Along with Ferguson, who would be paramount in pushing Monmouth into disaster, was one Major Wildman. Wildman, like Ferguson, had spent time in prison and was seen as a revolutionary politician. And one man who would also play a part in Monmouth's rebellious future was Nathaniel Wade, a law student who was a militant Whig from the equally dissenting West Country. It would not take long for Monmouth to become entangled in this potentially dangerous group of desperate men. The king himself had unwittingly played his part in making Monmouth the Prince of Wales without the legitimacy of the position. This naturally pushed Monmouth into the arms of these men, and therefore entwining him into their desire for the old cause. Joining this new group might not have pushed other men to acts of rebellion and treason. Other men might have simply counted their blessings, embraced the glory and wealth of his position, and enjoy the rank of Commander-in-Chief. But not Monmouth. He was a man who needed to believe, needed to be adored, and a man who was easily deceived. Deceived into thinking he was the rightful heir and would one day be king. After all, didn't men shout, "God bless the Protestant Duke, long live the Prince of Wales"? These words must have sounded so sweet. He was so close. Surely it was meant to be. Throughout the 1670s, he would never cease to enjoy hearing his praises sung. Young Jemmy is a lad that's royally descended, with every virtue clad, by every tongue commended. A true and faithful English heart, Great Britain's joy and hope, and bravely will maintain their part, in spite of Turk and Pope. If you missed our last episode on Monmouth's heroics at the Siege of Maastricht, click here. As always, thanks for watching.